Hello and welcome to another episode where we attempt to fall asleep, but we succeed because we have the help of Habibi Spice, who happened to be no other than me. I'm trying a new microphone setup today. This is a microphone that I have had, but I was lazy to set it up because I have to put it right here. But I am confident it will have the best sound quality so far because it is expensive. Anyway, tonight I want you to be relaxed because we are going to be continuing our story of Sherlock Holmes, or Sherlock Holmes if you're not cool. The Hound of the Baskervilles. I'm going to be reading chapter 2. If you don't know what happened in chapter 1, then watch the other video where I read chapter 1. Now let's give a few seconds because I hear Larry is coming. So let's give him a second to settle down. Let's give you a second to settle down. Correct? Hello, Habibi. Yes. You want to lay down so we can start reading the story? The Hound of the Baskervilles. Can you hear this commotion outside? Chapter 2. The Curse of the Baskervilles. I have in my pocket a manuscript, said Dr. James Mortimer. I saw it as you came in, said Holmes. It is an old manuscript. Early 18th century, unless it is fake. How can you know that, sir? I've been able to see an inch or two of it while you have been talking. I wouldn't be much of an expert if I couldn't say how old it was, within a decade or so. You may possibly have read my little article upon the subject. I'd say that manuscript was written in 1730. The exact date is 1742. Dr. Mortimer took it out of his pocket. This family paper was given to me by Sir Charles Baskerville, who died suddenly and tragically. There was much talk about it in Devonshire. I was his personal friend and his doctor. He was a smart man, sir, clever and practical. Yet he took this document very seriously, and his mind was prepared for what happened in the end. Holmes reached out his hand for the manuscript and laid it upon his knee. I looked over his shoulder at the paper, at the yellow paper and the faded script. At the top was written Baskerville Hall, and below in large numbers 1742. It looks like a statement of some sort. Yes, it is a statement of a legend that runs in the Baskerville family. But I thought that there was something else you wanted to talk with me about. There is. Something which must be decided within 24 hours. But the manuscript is short, and it has to do with why I came here. With your permission, I will read it to you. Holmes leaned back in his chair. He placed his fingertips together and closed his eyes, ready to listen. Dr. Mortimer began reading the story in a high, cracking voice. Much has been said about the Hound of the Baskervilles and where it came from, because I am related to Hugo Baskerville, and because I had heard the story from my father, who heard it from his father. I have written it down. I believe strongly that it happened just like this. From this story, learn to not fear the past, but rather to be careful in the future. Learn from this so that you don't suffer the way my family has. In the time of the Great Rebellion, Hugo Baskerville owns this manor. Hugo was a wild, rude man. He fell in love with the daughter of a farmer whose land was near the Baskerville estate. But the young maiden avoided him because she had heard how rude he was. So it happened that one day this Hugo, with 5 or 6 of his wicked friends, went to the farm and carried off the maiden. Her father and brothers were away from home, as he well knew. When they had brought her to the hall, they locked her in a room upstairs while Hugo and his friends ate and drank. Now the poor woman was scared by all the noise the man made. At last she did the bravest thing imaginable. She used the ivy which covered and still covers the south wall and climbed the hallway down. Then she headed towards her home across the moor. They were 10 miles between Hall and her father's farm. Some time later, Hugo left his guests to carry food and drink to the maiden. When he entered, he found that she was gone. Hugo was so angry that she rushed down the stairs into the dining hall. He jumped upon the great table, with plates and glasses flying everywhere. Hugo cried aloud that he would do anything to bring her back. Most of the men were shocked by this rage. One man, more wicked than the rest, cried out that they should have the hounds chase after her. Then Hugo ran from the house, crying to the men that they should saddle his mare and unkennel the pack of dogs. He let the hounds sniff a kerchief of the maidens, and then he sent them after her. They ran off, howling in the moonlight over the moor. Ya haram. He's like, here you go, Habib. Sniff this and go do your job, little doggies. Now for some time the men stood with their mouths open, taking in what just happened. But soon they realized how much excitement was ahead. Finally some sense came back to their minds, and all 13 of them got on their horses and went after Hugo and the maiden. They quickly rode side by side, taking the path that the maiden must have taken if she were to reach her own home. They had gone a mile or two when they passed one of the night shepherds upon the moorlands. They called to him to know if he had seen the hunt. And the man, as the story goes, was so overcome with fear that he could barely speak. At last he said that he had actually seen the unhappy maiden with the hounds after her. But I have seen more than that, said he. For Hugo Baskerville passed me upon his black mare, and behind him ran a hound that was truly terrifying. So the men rode onward. But soon there came a galloping across the moor, and the black mare that Hugo has been riding, looking frightened, ran past with an empty saddle. The men rode together because they were so afraid. Riding slowly as a group, they came at last upon the hounds. These dogs were known to be tough, but they were all whimpering in the valley upon the moor. Some were backing away, and some were gazing down the valley in front of them. So these doggies are strong doggies, but yet they were still scared of what lies beneath them, in front of their eyes. What could it be? Could it be the US government? All of the excitement had left the men by this point. Most of them didn't dare go farther, but 3 of the boldest rode forward down into the valley. Now It opened into a large space in which stood two great stones, which are still there today. The moon was shining bright upon the clearing, and there in the center lay the body of Hugo Baskerville. Plucking at his throat, there stood a terrible thing. It was a great black beast, shaped like a hound, yet larger than any hound that anyone had ever seen. And while they watched, the thing tore at Hugo Baskerville and then turned its blazing eyes and dripping jaws upon them. The three shrieked with fear and rode for dear life, still screaming, across the moor. One, it is said, died that very night of what he had seen. The other two were but broken men for the rest of their days. The maiden, as it turned out, had made it back to her home by horseback. Although they found the tracks later, no one ever learned who was riding the horse or how they happened to come upon her at her time of need. Such is the tale, my sons, of the coming of the hound, which is said to have haunted the family ever since. If I have written it down, it is because having it on paper is less scary than a story that can only be hinted at. Many of the family have died unhappy deaths, which have been sudden, bloody, and mysterious. I warn you, do not cross the moor in those dark hours of the night when the evil powers arise. Habibi is kind of dramatic, yeah? And there the manuscript ends. It was written from a descendant of Hugo Baskerville to his sons Roger and John. When Dr. Mortimer had finished reading this unusual story, he pushed his glasses up on his forehead and stared across at Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Holmes yawned and looked at the fire. "Well," said he, "do you not find it interesting?" To a collector of fairy tales, Dr. Mortimer pulled a folded newspaper out of his pocket. "Now, Mr. Holmes, I will give you something a little more recent. This is the Devon County Chronicle of May 14 of this year. It is a report of the fact about the death of Sir Charles Baskerville." My friend leaned a little forward at his expression, and his expression became serious. Our visitor readjusted his glasses and began. "The recent sudden death of Sir Charles Baskerville has cast a gloom over the county. Though Sir Charles had not lived at Baskerville Hall for long, his friendliness and extreme generosity were known by all. Although his ancestors had a bad reputation, he was able to make his own fortune and bring honor back to his family. Sir Charles, as is well known, made large sums of money in South Africa. Once rich, he returned to England. It is only 2 years since he moved into Baskerville Hall, and he was working hard to improve the place until his death interrupted his plans. He had no children of his own and wanted the whole countryside to profit by his good fortune. Many people are filled with grief over his death. His generous donations to local and county charities have been frequently mentioned in these columns. The events around the death of Sir Charles are still somewhat of a mystery. There is no reason to suspect violence or to imagine that death could be from any but natural causes. Sir Charles was a widower. In spite of his wealth, he was simple in how he lived his life. His indoor servants at Baskerville Hall were a married couple named Barrymore. The couple were named Barrymore? Both of them? Or is that their last name? The husband acted as butler and the wife as housekeeper. Their evidence backed up by that of several friends, shows that Sir Charles was having health problems. He had an issue with his heart, which resulted in changes of color, breathlessness, and fits of anxiety. Dr. James Mortimer, his friend and doctor, has confirmed this. The facts of the case are simple. Every night before bed, Sir Charles Baskerville was in the habit of walking down the famous yew alley of Baskerville Hall. On the 4th of May, Sir Charles was planning to leave the next day for London. He had asked Barrymore to prepare his luggage. That night, he went out as usual for his walk. He never returned. At 12 o'clock, Barrymore, finding the hall door still open, became alarmed. Lighting a lantern, he went in search of his master. The day had been wet, and Sir Charles' footmarks were easy to track down the alley. Halfway down this walk, there is a gate which leads out onto the moor. There were signs that Sir Charles had stood for some time there. He then went down the alley, and it was at the far end of it that his body was discovered. One fact which has not been explained is Barrymore's statement that his master's footprints changed from the time that he passed the moor gate. Past the gate, it looked like he was walking upon his toes. Murphy, a traveling horse dealer, was on the moor not far away at the time. He says that he heard cries but is unable to say where the sound came from. There were no signs of violence upon Sir Charles's body, but his face appeared twisted and pained. It was later explained that an expression could have been a common symptom in cases of difficulty breathing and death from heart problems. This explanation was proved correct by the post-mortem examination, which showed long-standing heart disease. The coroner's jury was in agreement with the medical evidence. It is good that this is so, because this way a member of Sir Charles's family can feel safe moving into the hall to continue the good work, which has been so sadly interrupted. There has been stories whispered in connection with his death, but the fact from the coroner put an end to them. Had they not, it might have been difficult to find someone to live in Baskerville Hall. It is understood that his closet relatives, do you hear my stomach? That his closest relative is Mr. Henry Baskerville, the son of Sir Charles Baskerville, younger brother. The young man, when last heard of, was in America, and letters are being sent to tell him of his good fortune. Dr. Mortimer refolded his paper and put it back in his pocket. Those are the public facts, Mr. Holmes, in connection with the death of Sir Charles Baskerville. I must thank you, said Sherlock Holmes, for calling my attention to a very interesting case. I had read about it in the newspaper at the time, but I was busy and hadn't looked closer. This article, you say, contains all the public facts? It does. Then let me have the private ones. Habibi, he knows what he's doing. He leaned back, put his fingertips together, and looked serious, but unconcerned. If I do that, said Dr. Mortimer, who had begun to look uncomfortable, I am telling you details I haven't told anyone. I didn't tell the coroner these facts because I didn't want to bother him with superstition. And I knew that Baskerville Hall, as the paper says, would certainly stay empty if anything were done to worsen its reputation. For both these reasons, I thought that it made sense to tell less than I knew, since no good could come from it. But with you there is no reason why I should not be perfectly honest. Few people live on the moor, and those who live near each other live very close together. For this reason, I saw a lot of Sir Charles Baskerville, except for Mr. Franklin of Laughter Hall and Mr. Stapleton, the naturalist. There are no other educated people within many miles. Sir Charles was a quiet man, but his illness brought us together. Our shared interest in science kept us so. He had brought back much scientific information from South Africa, and he spent many charming evenings together talking about it. Within the last few months, it became clear to me that Sir Charles was stressed to the breaking point. He had taken this legend, which I have read you, exceedingly to heart. Although he would walk in his room grounds, nothing could convince him to go out upon the hills of the moor at night. Incredible as it may seem, Mr. Holmes, he was honestly convinced that a terrible fate hung over his family. What he had learned about his ancestors was certainly not encouraging. The idea of some ghastly presence constantly haunted him. More than once, he has asked me whether I had ever seen any strange creatures or heard the barking of a hound at night. He asked me about the barking of a hound several times, and always with a voice which trembled with fear. I can remember driving up to his house in the evening about 3 weeks before his death. He happened to be at his hall door. I had stepped down from my horse-drawn carriage and was standing in front of him when I saw his eyes fix themselves over my shoulder and stare past me with an expression of total horror. I turned around and for a second saw something which I took to be a large black calf passing at the head of the drive. So excited and alarmed was he that I was driven to go down to the spot where the animal had been and look around for it. It was gone, however, and the incident appeared to bother him intensely. It stayed with him all evening. It was that night that he told me the story which I read to you when I first came. I mention this because it's important, considering what happened sometime later. I was convinced at the time that he was making a big deal about nothing. It was at my advice that Sir Charles was about to go to London. His heart was, I knew, under strain. The constant stress which he lived, however imaginary the cause of it might be, was clearly having a serious effect upon his health. I thought that a few months in town would make him a new man. Mr. Stapleton, a mutual friend who was worried about his health, agreed. Right before the trip, he died. On the night of Sir Charles's death, Barrymore, the butler who made the discovery, sent Perkins, the groom, on horseback to me. As I was sitting up late, I was able to reach Baskerville Hall within an hour of the event. I checked and backed up all the facts. I followed the footsteps down the yew alley. I saw the spot at the moor gate where he seemed to have waited. I saw the change in the shape of the prints after that point. I noted that there was no other footsteps except those of Barrymore on the soft gravel. And finally, I carefully examined the body, which had not been touched until my arrival. Sir Charles lay on his face, his arms out, his fingers dug into the ground. His face was so twisted with emotion that I could barely recognize him. There was certainly no physical injury of any kind, but one false statement was made by Barrymore at the investigation. He said that there were no traces upon the ground near the body. He did not observe any, but I did, a little way off, but fresh and clear. Footprints? Footprints. A man's or a woman's? Dr. Mortimer looked strangely at us for an instant, and his voice sank, almost to a whisper, as he answered. Mr. Holmes, they were the footprints of a gigantic hound. I don't know about you, but that sounds terrifying. What type of doggy is walking around this town? What is going on? We know that the footsteps start human and appear to end up not human. What is going on in these moments? Are we going to let Sherlock Holmes figure it out? Or are we going to use our own brains? I will answer this one for you. Don't use your brain right now. Okay? I want you to go to bed. It's getting late. You have shit to do tomorrow. Maybe. Even if you don't, you should sleep. So good night, Habibi. I will see you next time.